The Victorian Era, which lasted from 1837 to 1901 during Queen Victoria's reign, was a time of big changes in society, work, and culture. But it also had a dark side, with punishments that were downright cruel. Back then, people believed that being super strict would scare others into behaving and teach them good morals. The punishments, though, were often brutal and inhumane by today's standards. The Industrial Revolution was shaking things up, with cities growing fast and becoming overcrowded. Poverty was everywhere, and crime shot up. To keep things under control, the authorities came down hard with harsh laws and punishments. They believed in something called an eye for an eye justice, where the punishment had to match the crime. Unfortunately, this mindset often meant poor and vulnerable people got the worst of it. Punishments weren't just about teaching lessons to those who broke the rules. They were also a show for everyone else. Executions, public beatings, and prison sentences were carried out in front of crowds to make sure everyone knew who was in charge and what could happen if you stepped out of line. It was a pretty grim time to get on the wrong side of the law. Capital punishment, public executions. Public executions were a cornerstone of Victorian justice until their abolition in 1868. These events were designed to showcase the ultimate consequence of criminal behavior and act as a deterrent. Hanging was the most common method of execution, used for crimes ranging from murder to theft. However, the spectacle of public executions often turned these grim occasions into public entertainments rather than solemn warnings. One of the most infamous execution sites was Newgate Prison in London, where thousands would gather to witness the final moments of condemned criminals. The atmosphere during these events was both carnival-like and macabre, with food vendors, hawkers selling execution ballads, and pamphlets detailing the crimes of the executed. The condemned were often paraded through the streets in a somber procession, sometimes given the opportunity for a final drink or last words before their execution. Notable public executions. One of the most notorious cases was the execution of William Palmer, a doctor convicted of poisoning his victims. In 1856, an estimated 30,000 people gathered outside Stafford Prison to witness his hanging. The event was so popular that special trains were arranged to transport spectators. Palmer, upon mounting the scaffold, reportedly asked the executioner, "Are you sure it's safe?" A remark that only fueled public intrigue and the morbid fascination with his fate. Another famous execution was that of the Mannings, a married couple convicted of murdering their associate, Patrick O'Connor, in 1849. Their public execution at Horsemonger Lane Jail drew an enormous crowd, including Charles Dickens, who later condemned the practice, stating that public executions degraded and brutalized the spectators rather than deterring crime. He vividly described the drunkenness, uproar, and confusion among the crowd in his letters, arguing that such spectacles only fueled the public's appetite for violence. In 1864, the hanging of Franz Müller, a German tailor convicted of the first railway murder in Britain, also attracted thousands. His crime, murdering Thomas Briggs for his gold watch, shocked Victorian society. Müller was arrested after a dramatic police pursuit across the Atlantic and was ultimately brought to justice in a public execution. His case demonstrated the growing role of forensic investigation and international law enforcement in criminal justice. By the mid-19th century, growing concerns over the unruly behavior of crowds and the questionable moral effects of public executions led to debates about their efficacy. Critics, including reformers and writers like Dickens, argued that public executions did not deter crime, but instead desensitized society to violence. The 1868 Capital Punishment Amendment Act officially ended public executions in Britain, moving them inside prison walls, where they remained a grim but private affair. Although the spectacle of public executions was abolished, the brutality of capital punishment itself persisted well into the 20th century. The shift to private executions reflected changing attitudes towards justice, emphasizing reform and deterrence over public spectacle. However, the fascination with executions remained, as newspapers continued to report on the final moments of condemned prisoners, ensuring that the macabre legacy of public hangings endured in the public consciousness. Transportation, a life of exile. Transportation was another severe punishment during the Victorian era. Criminals, often convicted of petty theft or other non-violent crimes, were exiled to penal colonies in Australia. Initially introduced in the late 18th century, transportation served as both a punitive measure and a means of addressing overcrowded prisons in Britain. The journey itself was harrowing. Convicts endured months of cramped, unsanitary conditions aboard ships, where disease and malnutrition were common. Deaths during transportation were not unusual, and the survivors often arrived weakened and ill. Upon reaching Australia, convicts faced a harsh new reality. They were assigned to grueling labor, such as clearing land, constructing roads, and building settlements under the scorching sun. Many worked in chain gangs, subjected to strict discipline and harsh punishments for any perceived insubordination. Isolation was another significant aspect of transportation. Convicts were separated from their families, with little to no hope of reunion. Letters and communication were rare, and many never saw their loved ones again. The psychological toll of exile was immense, as individuals struggled with alienation, loneliness, and the stigma of their convict status. The case of Mary Bryant, a convict sent to Australia in 1788, highlights the hardships of transportation. Convicted of theft, Bryant and her family were sent to Botany Bay. Despite the harsh conditions, she managed to escape in a small boat with her family and a few others, navigating thousands of miles to safety, a testament to the desperation and resilience of transported convicts. While transportation was often seen as a less brutal alternative to execution, it effectively condemned individuals to a lifetime of suffering. The punishment continued until 1868, when the practice was officially abolished. By then, over 162,000 men, women, and children had been transported to Australia, leaving a lasting legacy on both British and Australian history. The penal colonies eventually evolved into thriving settlements, but the stories of the convicts and their struggles remain a testament to the harshness of Victorian justice. Imprisonment, the rise of the silent system. Victorian prisons were designed to break the spirit of inmates through extreme discipline and isolation. The silent system, implemented in many prisons, required inmates to remain silent at all times. Communication, even through gestures, was strictly forbidden. This practice aimed to encourage reflection and repentance, but often led to severe psychological distress. Prisoners were subjected to monotonous and physically demanding tasks, such as the crank and the tread wheel. The crank involved turning a handle thousands of times a day, while the tread wheel required prisoners to walk continuously on a rotating cylinder, often with little purpose other than punishment. These tasks were grueling, purposeless, and designed to instill obedience through suffering. Conditions in Victorian prisons were abysmal. Overcrowding, poor sanitation, and inadequate nutrition were rampant. Diseases such as typhus and tuberculosis spread rapidly, and many prisoners died from neglect or abuse. The case of the Pentonville prison in London exemplifies the harshness of the silent system. Opened in 1842, it subjected inmates to solitary confinement and absolute silence, often leading to mental breakdowns and suicides. Flogging. Pain as a deterrent. Flogging or whipping was a common punishment for both men and women during the Victorian era. It was administered with instruments such as the cat-o'-nine-tails, a whip with multiple knotted cords, or birch rods. The punishment was often carried out publicly, serving as a warning to others. Flogging was particularly brutal in the military and navy, where discipline was rigorously enforced. Sailors could receive hundreds of lashes for infractions such as insubordination or desertion. The physical pain was excruciating, and the scars left behind served as permanent reminders of the punishment. Women and children were not exempt from flogging. In workhouses and orphanages, corporal punishment was often used to maintain order. The practice reflected the era's belief in the moral benefits of physical discipline, despite its often devastating physical and psychological effects. Notable accounts of naval punishments, such as the flogging of Midshipman Philip Spencer aboard the USS Somers in 1842, demonstrate the severity and controversy surrounding this practice. Execution by garrote, a rare but horrific punishment. While hanging was the primary method of execution, the garrote was occasionally used for particularly heinous crimes. This method involved strangling the condemned with a tightened cord or metal collar. Although less common in Britain, it was used in some of its colonies and was known for its excruciating and prolonged death. The garrote gained infamy in Spain and its colonies, where it was the primary method of execution for centuries. One notable case was the execution of Mariana de Pineda in 1831, a Spanish liberalist who was sentenced to death by garrote for her political activities against Ferdinand VII's absolutist regime. Her death sparked outrage and turned her into a martyr for the liberal cause. In the Philippines, under Spanish colonial rule, the garrote was used to execute national hero José Rizal in 1896. Rizal's execution, carried out in a public square in Manila, symbolized the oppressive nature of Spanish rule and fueled the Philippine Revolution against colonial authorities. The garrote was also occasionally employed in British-controlled territories for high-profile cases. In India, during the British Raj, it was sometimes used against rebels or criminals deemed particularly dangerous. The method's association with prolonged suffering made it a feared and loathed form of punishment. The use of the garrote reflected the era's focus on punishment as both retribution and deterrence. Although it has since been abolished, its legacy endures as a grim reminder of the brutal methods once employed in the name of justice. Branding and maiming, marks of shame. Branding and maiming were practices used to permanently mark criminals as a form of public humiliation. Branding involved burning a mark, such as the letter T for thief, onto the skin. This punishment was not only physically painful, but also socially stigmatizing, as it identified individuals as criminals for life. Notable cases of branding include highwaymen in 17th and 18th century Britain, who were often marked before being executed or transported. Maiming, though less common, involved the amputation of body parts as punishment for certain crimes. For example, in medieval England, thieves could have their hands cut off, while poachers faced disfigurement. Though these practices declined over the course of the Victorian era, their legacy underscored the brutal nature of justice during this time. The famous case of Jonathan Wild, an infamous 18th century thief-taker who met a public death but whose associates bore marks of branding, reflects this grim era. In Britain's colonies, punishment could be even more severe. Indigenous populations and rebellious subjects were often subjected to extreme measures to maintain colonial control. Floggings, executions, and other forms of torture were used to suppress dissent and enforce British authority. The brutality of these punishments reflected the racial and cultural prejudices of the era. The Sepoy Rebellion of 1857 provides a stark example of colonial punishments. Following the revolt, captured rebels were often executed by being strapped to the mouths of cannons and blown apart, a method intended to terrify and subdue local populations. Similarly, in Ireland during the 1798 uprising, public floggings and executions were used to crush rebellion and demonstrate imperial authority. These brutal acts became symbols of resistance among subjugated peoples and fueled anti-colonial movements. By the late Victorian era, reform movements began to challenge the harshness of the penal system. Activists such as Elizabeth Fry and John Howard advocated for more humane treatment of prisoners and the abolition of public executions. Their efforts contributed to the gradual decline of brutal punishments and the introduction of more rehabilitative approaches to justice. The Prisons Act of 1865, for instance, sought to standardize prison conditions and reduce the use of corporal punishment. This legislation mandated regular inspections and better sanitary conditions, aiming to shift the focus from retribution to rehabilitation. The abolition of transportation in 1868 and public executions the same year marked significant shifts in the penal system. Organizations like the Howard League for Penal Reform continued to push for change into the 20th century, fostering a legacy of compassion and justice that starkly contrasted with the brutality of earlier eras.